School counselors, nurses of Reddit, what is the most embarrassing or WTF reason a kid has ended up in your office? A guy in one of my HS Chem classes tried sneaking some sodium, if I remember right, out of the classroom. He unfortunately decided he would hide it in a paper towel in his crotch. He eventually sweated enough to activate it and ended up burning his crotch pretty badly. School had to call an ambulance. I have one involving both counselors and nurses. I have very well documented allergies to things like peanuts and pet dander and dust mites and fabric softener and anything that flowers. So, basically, I am always having some kind of allergic reaction. My school had a zero tolerance policy, so I had to go to the nurse and ask politely for my allergy medication on the relatively frequent occasions I would break out in painful hives. After realizing I was doing this, the school counselor started intercepting me to interrogate me about why I was trying to get out of class, what was really bothering me, and if I had found some clever new way to get high. The phrase, "No, really, look at these nasty hives all over my arms," meant nothing to her. She eventually called my allergist to ask him hypothetically if it was possible for me to have reactions this frequently. Then called my parents and suggested they consider taking me to a psychologist, because it might be psychosomatic. It wasn't. My immune system is just shit. I put my hand through a window in high school trying to kill a bug on the window. When I got to the nurse, she was like, "Sweet. Nothing like this ever happens." One day in 8th grade we were doing an experiment with boiling water. I sat on the lab tables, because cool kids don't sit in chairs. I was about a foot away from the boiling water, and a kid ran into the table and spilled it all over my ass. I ran all around the room and to the nurse's office, where instead of ice packs they had bullshit frozen paper towels. Called my mom. She didn't believe me, but came an hour later and took me to the emergency room. 2nd degree burns all over my ass and hands. I was thereafter known as rump roast. I'll throw myself in here. Not a nurse but the embarrassing kid. I grew up with a dairy allergy. Not lactose intolerance. Like an actual allergy where I was told that my throat would close and eyes swell up, or it did a couple times when I was much younger. Was pretty vigilant about not eating dairy, so I don't have an actual memory of reaction. Well, 2nd day of my freshman year, I bought a sub and checked it for cheese. Ate half of it before I realized there was white Swiss on it. I freaked out and went to the office and told them. They called an ambulance and my parents rushed there. And it turns out I've definitely grown out of the allergy. 10 years later and my friends still harass me about the time I got scared by a sandwich and called an ambulance. Still embarrassed about it every time. Edit, man. Reddit knows how to take the edge off of an ancient embarrassing moment. Next time my friends make fun of me, I'll laugh knowing, whatever. I didn't die and it got me Reddit gold. Thank you. D. When I was in grade 9 we were reenacting battles from wars with marshmallow ammunition in the schoolyard and somebody whipped a marshmallow right into my open eye. This sounds like the wimpiest injury ever. And it really was. But it hurt and I couldn't open my eye or see. I had to go to the nurse and explain that the black eye I was getting was from a marshmallow and she had to do like an eye rinse to get out all the powdery sugar. She even called my mom and they just laughed at me. We did a starfish dissection in 7th grade and this guy in my class ate the starfish for $10. Never asked him how it tasted. We dissected a pig in biology in high school and a guy stuck his scalpel up its throat and was walking around the classroom quoting lines from Lord of the Flies. Needless to say he got suspended for it. A boy in my 7th grade class snorted a line of sugar he poured from a pixie stick. He promptly got a severe nosebleed that would not stop and he had to go to the nurse's office and he was there until his mum could pick him up and take him home. You know how your teachers would always yell at you when you tilted your chair back because they once had a kid bust their head open after falling? Yeah, I'm that kid. I got sent to the nurse once for getting quarters stuck up my nose. Some kid bet me that I couldn't fit 3/4 up my nose. He was wrong. Never considered how I'd get them out. not a nurse. One day I decided that my bully had enough fun with me. So I dumped crazy glue into his hands and told him it will make your hair gleam. Once he put his hands into his hair. Insta-stick. He spent 3-4 hours with the nurse cutting his hair. He didn't come back to school for 3 weeks. I had a friend who cut himself pretty deep with scissors. He proceeded to try to see how many pieces of .7 lead he could stick into his body. He got about halfway through one piece when it broke inside him and he had excruciating pain which he described as a burning and stinging. We were only in middle school. And he went to the school nurse who tried to squeeze it out of him and then just assumed it had entered the bloodstream and left him alone. My mom is a school nurse. One day, after the school day ended, she was about to leave when someone came to get her about an emergency. A student needed something from his locker in a sports locker room. The door was locked. He decided he would crawl into the ceiling. Over the door. Over the locker room. Drop down from the ceiling. Get what he needed. And crawl back out through the ceiling. The kid fell through the ceiling before he could make it inside the locker room. Well, I was a student one time. I had hickeys and the nurse police thought I was getting abused. Called my parents and everything. Not entirely the same thing, but in my freshman Gen Chem lab someone managed to stick a glass funnel all the way through their hand. He had been trying to fit a hose around it and accidentally stabbed himself with it. It didn't help that his was somewhat chipped at the end, making it sharper. They ended up having to call an ambulance. It was rather gory. Lab was cancelled though. I guess one man's misery is another man's fortune. We were dissecting rats in 9th grade and bet a kid that he wouldn't eat the rat's gonads for $30. He did. He had to be taken to the hospital to get his stomach pumped because the rat's gonads were covered in formaldehyde. Not a counselor. But one time a group of boys streaked at a homecoming game. At the time, our football field had a sheety wire fence around it. So, when they made it across the field to the fence, 2 of them made it over. The third left part of his ball sack stuck to the fence. In my freshman biology in high school, there were 2 kids who were throwing sharp dissecting objects at the ceiling, while the teacher was out of the classroom. To get them lodged in the ceiling, like people do with pencils sometimes, during our frog dissections, and one of the kids accidentally stabbed the other one with a scalpel in his shoulder. The kid who got stabbed got pissed and punched the other kid and they both ended up going the nurse. I thought it was pretty WTF. Our art room was directly above the shop room, both on an exterior corner of the school. For some reason, the shop exhaust tube was turned upside down one day, making it vent directly into the art room's intake. The counselors were perplexed when they had a room full of sick and loopy students. They accused us of all getting high, and we were all sent back to the art room, until even the teacher presented with the same symptoms. I think all we did was sit outside for a bit. Then we all continued on with our day in other classrooms. I once got sent to the principal in 5th grade because I went to the nurse after hurting my knee in gym. But the teachers thought that I was there to cheer on a friend who had gotten into a fight that I didn't even know happened. Turns out my principal thought that she knew everything about every individual kid because she took a class about child development. The same principal also accused me of insubordination because I was wearing the same coat as the offender. Found out it wasn't me. And still gave me a detention. TLDR, my principal was a power tripping hunt who got me a ridiculous number of detentions and counselor trips for an elementary school student. Edit, this was a recurring thing throughout grade school between us. I once got one of those rubber earbud pieces stuck in my ear in high school. I tried fishing it out with my fingers, a pencil, etc. But it was lodged pretty tight. So finally I said duck it and went to the nurse. Since she knew that I was going to music school for college pursuing music, she didn't want to touch it because if something went wrong she didn't want to be responsible for damaging my hearing. So, she gave me the name of an ent doctor and called my mother to come pick me up. The ent doctor went in with tweezers and plucked it right out. Kind of a waste of time. But I got to miss most of a day of classes for it, so it was all good. My ex got his big dick stuck in his zipper and the nurse had to help him unzip. When I was in first grade, my parents bought me some ridiculous costume jewelry and I decided to wear a flimsy metal ring, comparable to what you'd get from a gumball machine, to school one day. For some dumb reason, I decided to stick my entire finger in my mouth and bite down on the ring while it was on my finger. It would bend from my biting it. And I thought it was cool and interesting. When I finally realized that this might have been a foolish thing to do, I had bit down on the ring so much that I couldn't get the ring off. We had a substitute that day that seemed really mean. So I was afraid to say anything to her. So I kept biting down on it, hoping that I could somehow bend it back to its original state and I'd be able to get it off. Wrong. I ended up biting down on it so much that it crimped down on my finger. I still didn't want to say anything to the teacher for worry of getting in trouble. So I just kept messing with it, making it worse. After about 15 minutes and developing a cold, purple, dying finger, I finally freaked the hell out and burst into tears. The teacher was surprisingly nice about my little problem and sent me to the nurse. The school nurse dunked my hand in ice water and then would try to yank it off. It didn't work, but I think the ice water bath kept me from losing my finger forever. And after a half hour, she called my mother. My mom is not one who's great in a crisis and freaked out as much as 6-year-old me did. She called my dad while he was at work. She drove me there, and he cut the ring off with some bolt cutters or nipping pliers in about 3 seconds. I cried because I felt so dumb, and he felt bad that I felt bad. So he bought me an ice cream cone from Thrifties and got to skip out on school for the rest of the day. TLDR, almost docked my own finger off like a puppy dog's tail while in school. Dad saved the day and I got cookies and cream and the day off as a reward for being an idiot. My son's middle school had a really skittish nurse. I am not sure what her qualifications were, but she called for an ambulance about twice a week. My son is asthmatic and had a complicated regimen back then. This woman just couldn't handle it for some reason. So we had to have my son take his meds right before and right after school. And he had to smuggle in his inhaler. But he never got flack for that until the end of his second year there. One day, he hit his head in shop class. Not bad. But they sent him to the nurse. She calls me at work and says I had to pick him up. I told her to call my wife, who worked from home and was 5 minutes away. She couldn't process that and said no. I had to pick him up. I said that was silly. I was at least an hour away. And why my wife was primary contact. She said she didn't answer the phone. I sent an IM to my wife, and she said she hadn't gotten a call. So she called the school. The nurse insists that if I am anything of a responsible father, I was to be there in 10 minutes or she's sending my son to the hospital. WTF? I am an hour away. My wife can be there in 5 minutes. So my wife gets through, and the nurse speaks to her. I forgot what led to this, but my wife ends up in a fight with the nurse who refuses to tell her about why her son was being sent to hospital. So my wife says she'll be there in 5 minutes to sort it all out. The nurse considers this a threat to her life and calls the cops, so my wife is met at the school nurse office by the police and EMTs because the nurse called an ambulance. During this, an EMT calls me because the nurse is dealing with my wife and the cops. He says my son is fine, just a little freaked out because some woman claiming to be my ex-wife or something is being accused of threatening bodily harm to the nurse. In the end, no one was arrested, and my wife sent my son back to class. My wife said the nurse was so crazy. The cops pretty much took my wife's side right away. But she was no longer allowed on school grounds because the vice principal was also crazy and scared of my wife. The next time my son was in the nurse's office, he was caught with his prescribed inhaler. I had to come pick it up right away because it was a unauthorized potential explosive contaminant. I got the call walking my dog, and the school was 5 minutes away. So I just went right over. Oh man. The second that nurse saw my Pekingese, She flipped the duck out. Said it was a dirty dog. And some kid allergic to dogs could die. And wow. She wouldn't even get near me and had an office aide hand me the inhaler. That woman was crazy. We have a student, 1st grade, who poops his pants on purpose when he wants to go home. About once a week. I worked at a summer camp. And apparently they had to stop selling rabbit pelts in the gift shop because boys would buy them. Masturbate with them. Not clean them up so the cum would get the fur all stiff and pointy. Try and use it again the next night and scratch up their big digs and have to go to the nurse. Edit. I don't know why boys would use the pelts to masturbate with other than that the fur was really soft. I was never a 12-year-old boy with a pen 15. I got sent to the counselor because somehow she heard I had sex with a semi-popular grade 12 guy. I was in grade 11, and she wanted to know if it was a rumor or not. Itch, get out of my business : Edit. To add that I was so embarrassed. I left school for the rest of the day. Middle school counselor here. Not really WTF, but a 7th grader came to see me in tears because she thought she might be pregnant. After some discussion, I realized that she had given a handy and thought she could get pregnant from getting semen on her hands. Edit. Apparently this is WTF. And my standard for WTF is a bit too high. I feel uncomfortable sharing my more crazy stories and many of them are just real depressing. In 2nd grade I went to the nurse's office with a good sized hole in my ear. I fell while running to the bathroom and slammed my head into the corner of a filing cabinet. The nurse had no idea what to do. So she put dry gauze on the hole. Later it became very apparent that that was a bad idea. One winter in junior high, my classmates engaged in running across a frozen pond for kicks and giggles. One of them decided he would run across barefoot. And suckily for him, the ice decided to break under his bare soles. Needless to say there were cuts and blood all over. And since our school's nurse was on lunch break, our maths teacher had to carry him to a nearby school where they could tend to him. When I was in 2nd grade, a boy held a pencil point up on my chair. And I sat on it. It traveled through my jeans and underwear without any damage. And stuck firmly in my little butt cheek. On this day, we happened to have a substitute teacher. And when I started crying, she took me into the in-classroom restroom and looked at my butt. Informed me that the tip of the pencil was stuck in there. And I took off running and crying down the hall. I turned a corner and the janitor, Rafe, called out, "Do you have a pass ? To which I replied, "There's a pencil stuck in my butt." Then I continued down the hall to the nurse's office. The school nurse, Sherry, was a very sweet lady. She calmed me down, called my mom to ask for permission to touch my butt, and plucked it out. I got to go home for the day. I consider it a win. TR. Dr. Nurse pluck some wood out my tush. Edit. Thank you so much for the gold. I really appreciate it. I got sent to the principal's one time because my friend apparently tried calling Pizza Hut but instead called the superintendent by accident and asked for the family deal. When the man on the other end of the line asked who it was, he replied with my name. Edit. Because everyone keeps complaining it didn't happen. Which it would seem like because I didn't explain it very well. To clarify, he called the number for Pizza Hut. The guy on the other end hung up because my friend was laughing and couldn't execute the prank. Then Dumbus decided to hit 69 thinking that it would call the last person that the phone called. Which is wrong because it calls the last person that called. Which happened to be the superintendent. In my high school Gen Chem lab we had about 10 students. One of which got his fingers stuck in a wooden test tube rack. He hid that hand behind his back for a good amount of time before our lab teacher noticed and asked why he was doing so. He ended up having to have the jewelry teacher in the classroom next door saw it off. I was a school nurse. The saddest ones are the ones that have to be sent to my office. Then home. Repeatedly for head lice. The parents often don't give a shit. Sometimes the only solution is to have the kids shave their heads. Those kids are so embarrassed.